Good evening, everyone. Happy National Voter Registration Day, and welcome to the virtual John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Mari Jones, and I'm a senior at the college studying government and African American studies, and I'm a student president of the Institute of Politics, zooming in here from South Boston. This fall, the IOP continues to support Harvard students across the globe who share a sense of purpose to make a difference for our nation and our world. While we cannot join together in person, technology allows us to convene virtually, and bringing forums online allows us to share Harvard University's premier arena for political speech, discussion, and debate across many states and countries. The fall elections face unprecedented challenges of administering voting during a global pandemic, maintaining public health protocols, while planning for a substantial increase in absentee voting. Across the country, secretaries of state are at the center of this historic moment, and we welcome two public servants, a Republican and a Democrat, who know these responsibilities firsthand to discuss these contemporary challenges. Tonight's forum features Michigan Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, and former Kentucky Secretary of State and former Director of the Institute of Politics, Director Trey Grayson. I had the pleasure of interning in Secretary Benson's office this past summer. It was a unique and awesome experience that I'm so grateful for, and I look forward to all the work she will continue to do and that the state of Michigan will continue to do. Jocelyn Benson serves as Michigan's 43rd Secretary of State. She is the former dean of Wayne State University's Law School in Detroit, Michigan. Jocelyn graduated from Harvard Law School in 2004 and spent her time on campus as general editor of the Harvard Civil Rights Civil Liberties Law Review. She served as the voting rights policy coordinator of the Harvard Civil Rights Project, a nonprofit organization that sought to link academic research to civil rights advocacy efforts, and worked on the passage of the federal Help America Vote Act. She is the author of State Secretaries of State, Guardians of the Democratic Process. The book highlights best practices of secretaries from throughout the country and seeks to inform voters about how secretaries of state from either side of the political spectrum can work to advance democracy and election reform. Jocelyn credits her time researching the book as the inspiration to run for office. Trey Grayson is a member of the law firm Frost Brown Todd and managing director of the firm's government relations affiliate, Civic Point. Trey served as a two-term Secretary of State for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He was the president of the National Association of Secretaries of State and the chair of the Republican Secretaries of State Association. After leaving the Secretary of State's office, Trey returned to his alma mater to serve as the director of the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics from 2011 to 2014, becoming deeply engaged on campus, including service as a freshman academic advisor, faculty fellow of the men's basketball team, and a member of the senior common room for Kirkland House. It is also my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderators, Maya Woods Arthur, and Michelle Zhang. Maya is a sophomore from Washington, D.C. and lives in Quincy House, concentrating in sociology with a citation in Arabic. She is director of organizing for the Harvard Votes Challenge and a member of the College Democrats. Michelle is a senior originally from Battle Creek, Michigan. She concentrates in economics and normally lives in Boho House. She is director of communications for Harvard Votes Challenge, and her goal is to have every single eligible student at Harvard to cast their ballots in November. I hope you will join us again in the forum this Thursday, September 24th, for a panel on Election 2020, Republicans Challenge the President, featuring Tim Miller, political director, Republican Voters Against Trump, Christopher Purcell, co-founder, 43 alumni for Biden and former Bush administration staffer, Steve Schmidt, founder of the Lincoln Project, MSNBC contributor and chief strategist, McCain-Palin Campaign 2008, moderated by Tara Setmayer, CNN political commentator, senior advisor for the Lincoln Project, and IOP resident fellow from this past spring. Next week, we are honored to host Human Rights Campaign President Alfonso David with HKS professor Tim McCarthy in celebration of LGBTQ History Month. Throughout this semester, we look forward to hosting engaging speakers who will provide insight and challenge our perspectives, starting with tonight. Until then, I thank you and hope that you enjoyed tonight's conversation. Maya and Michelle, I'm turning it over to you both.
Thanks, Mari. And thank you guys for joining us tonight. I guess I'll start with Jocelyn and ask about your title as Secretary of State. Can you talk a little about your responsibilities, what that means, the significance your role plays in administering elections, and in particular this year, administering safe and secure elections?
Well, yes, and thank you all for having me here tonight. And it's really an honor and a treat. I wish I could be on campus with all of you, but it's great to be celebrating National Voter Registration Day by celebrating the role that secretaries of state play in ensuring that every vote is counted and every voice is heard. As Secretary of State of Michigan, I'm the state's chief election officer, which means I really set statewide policy and oversee and issue statewide guidelines for our 1,500 local clerks who administer the day-to-day operations of our elections. And in that way, it's a real state and local partnership making everything work. And it's a really tremendous responsibility and honor, particularly to hold this office this year, not just because of the historic moment that we're in, managing a significant, decisive presidential election in the midst of a global pandemic, but also because in 2018, the year I was elected, the citizens of the state of Michigan also enacted 2 amendments to our state constitution. One that dramatically rewrote our rules of voting in the state, making it so people can register to vote up to and on election day, automatically register when they get their driver's license or state ID, and also creating a right to vote by mail in our state, which has proved to be a very fortuitous decision this year, where that's been something that's really taken center stage. Citizens also voted into existence some mandatory statewide audits and a number of other changes to our state constitution. And alongside of that, created a second amendment, which was the Citizens Redistricting Commission, and put my office is squarely in charge of administering both amendments, which we've done and implemented over the past 2 years. And so, that has made it truly a new day for democracy in our state, where we're so much closer to being a state where citizens make the decisions more than politicians. And that's been really key as well in the lead up to this momentous cycle, where you have, such a hyper-partisan, frankly, toxic political environment that we're operating in, where our work as secretaries of state is to really just cut through that noise and rhetoric and deliver to citizens of all backgrounds and political affiliations the information they need to vote and ensure their votes are counted this year.
Thank you, Jocelyn. So turning away from elections for a quick second, I have spoken to a lot of college students who feel an overwhelming desire to get involved in this election cycle, whether it's on the national level, focusing on national issues, or taking a more local approach to things and working with their city council, for example. So Trey, what would you say to college students who are looking to get involved but don't necessarily know where to start?
There really are a lot of opportunities, and in fact, it can be a bit overwhelming. The national races are the ones that get the most interest and publicity, but to be honest, if you want to make the biggest difference, I'd suggest getting involved at that local level, even as close as a city or a county race. That's certainly where you can probably make a bigger difference, and you maybe need it a little bit more. I mean, there's a couple of ways you can do this. So one is, getting online and finding the party organizations. I think for folks who are watching here today, to be honest, if they just put, reach out to the IOP, we can plug them into somebody. There's somebody in the IOP family somewhere in this viewing audience in the state or community, and we can connect you. And if you don't really know, ask your teacher. I mean, one of the things that I've discovered, and I'm 48 years old now, when I was trying to figure this stuff out when I was in college, I was always struck by, it turns out you're only 1 or 2 people away from getting to the right person if you just start asking and start seeking. And that search process is easier now with the internet, but it's not too late. We're already voting. We saw the stories of Fairfax County, Virginia, that started in-person voting, and then other states and absentee ballots are being sent out. So it's not too late, but those local races are where you probably can get plugged in at the last minute. And so those county officials, the state parties, websites. You can also just do things on your own. You can organize your friend. I mean, my younger daughter, when Justice Ginsburg passed away over the weekend, started putting a lot of information on her Snap stories and her Instagram stories, and actually got a couple of her friends who had not registered to vote yet to go ahead and register because it's not too late. And so there are things you can do on your own without getting plugged into a political party or a campaign. It's lots of different ways, and I don't know there's any one right way other than you just got to start reaching out.
Thanks, Trey. And I think kind of on the topic of young people looking for an opportunity to get kind of plugged in and engaged, we are kind of in a nationwide poll worker shortage. Jocelyn, I'm wondering what states are doing to kind of fill this gap, how you think states are responding, and what messaging you think is most effective at increasing poll worker signups?
Well, certainly, the need to have, smart people running our elections is perennial. We always need good people to step up at every level, whether it's serving as poll workers in precincts on the front lines, election workers behind the scenes, processing ballots or making sure voters get their ballots on time, or serving as local clerks or secretaries of state. The work and the need is significant. And so, certainly any way to get involved this year or other years, I want to encourage you to do so. But this year, the need to fill poll worker shortages has taken on a new sense of urgency, with the pandemic creating really historic shortages as traditional election workers may choose to opt out this year due to the pandemic. Some and many may be immune compromised or otherwise just uncomfortable working. And so we developed a program actually at the suggestion of in the spring of a college baseball coach who said, how can I help? I've got a team. We want to support elections this year. What's the work we can do? And my wonderful Harvard alum and director of special projects, Sally Marsh, said, I have an idea. Why don't you be poll workers? And through that, we began to develop this program in partnership with many collegiate and professional sports teams, actually, getting athletes who weren't playing sports to serve as poll workers. And we called it Democracy MVP, with the idea that our most valuable players in a democracy are our election workers. Once we set up that program that was really just led entirely by Sally, it expanded really exponentially under her leadership through the pandemic, and students and professionals and lawyers and business leaders all jumped on board, because it also was a quite simple but very important way to contribute to making elections work this year. And all this happened in April and May, when you started to see long lines, and in June in states like Wisconsin and Georgia, with people waiting to vote in primaries. Those long lines were in part a product of election officials having to close down precincts because they couldn't find people to staff them. And so you had consolidated precincts, longer lines, among other things. And recognizing that more people wanted to be part of a solution, more people wanted to join. And then LeBron James got involved and said, what can I do? And we said, help us recruit election workers. And so his organization, More Than a Vote, which Secretary Grayson and I are both advising, added poll worker recruitment to its list of things it was doing, and really elevated this need for election workers to an even greater level, to the point where now in Michigan, we have exceeded our goal of recruiting 20,000 election workers this fall. And that has enabled us to be more flexible and do a couple of things. One, transition to training, making sure every election worker who does plan to work this fall is prepared to do the jobs we need them to do, which is significant. Secondly, it's given us flexibility. Some of those 20,000 and more, and more continuing to come in, will be serving at the polls and precincts on election day. Others will be working behind the scenes to help process historic number of absentee ballots. So that enthusiasm has really enabled us to be more flexible and fill gaps that we are just recognizing and that we have and that are emerging. And then finally, it's also helped us create kind of a last minute portal of alternate poll workers to be on call on election day to fill last minute unexpected vacancies that could occur up until the day of or the morning of the elections. That enables us to, again, ensure precincts are open on time and that we quickly adjust and adapt to it to address any emerging issues that happen on election day. All of it's made possible by this well-trained workforce of committed volunteers who will be serving as election workers this year. That's Michigan's success story. Nearly every state has done a extraordinary work around recruiting poll workers this year: Ohio, Nebraska, Iowa. And so, if you want to serve as an election worker, it's not too late. It's likely you're needed. So go to the state's website that you're in, sign up to be an election worker. If you're in Michigan, go to michigan.gov/democracy-MVP, because we still need folks. The need is really enduring, and know that that is one of the most significant ways that you can be a part of team democracy this year in, again, one of the most valuable positions there is.
So, Secretary Benson's right about all the innovation going on. Obviously Michigan, but some of the things that I've seen that have been great. For example, attorneys every year have to get this sort of amount of continuing legal education. So in many states, the states are saying to their attorneys, if you serve as a poll worker, you can get some hours that you need. There are companies that are stepping up and telling their employees, if you want to serve as a poll worker, it'll be treated as a paid day of work. Western Southern Life, which is a big employer in the greater Cincinnati region where I live, some may know them as the sponsor of a big tennis tournament. It's the week before the US Open. Western Southern has offered that. Frank LaRose, the Secretary of State of Ohio, his family's in the beer business. And so he convinced the craft beer distributors to put sleeves around the cans of beer and bottles of beer that are being distributed across Ohio, encouraging poll workers. And he also created a website where you can log on and see what the need is in your community. Because one of the things that we're finding is in some places Michigan's fortunate that they've been able to hit their goal. But in my state and in other states, there's some counties that have hit it and there's others who haven't. And so Secretary LaRose created this portal so you can go online, not just sign up, but you can see, oh, in Hamilton County, we need this number. But in Claremont County, we only need this number, and I'm going to make up a county. Summit County, we don't need anybody. We're in a good spot. We just need alternates. So there's so much innovation. It's one of the silver linings of this pandemic and this important election is that there's this great thinking going on all across the country. Hopefully these things will continue as we go forward, because we always, as Secretary Benson said, we always need poll workers in every single election. Groups like United Way recruiting volunteers, college fraternities and sororities doing it for beer money, not that anybody underage should drink beer, but lots of innovation, lots of creativity, and it's going to make this election a lot more successful than maybe we would have thought 6 months ago.
And if I could just add, importantly, this is an example as well as why it's important for secretaries of state to collaborate across party lines, which is something that the National Association of Secretaries of State and certainly, legacies left by Secretary Grayson and many others who've been committed to that bipartisan leadership has really led to, a lot of fruitful results this year because we all are, regardless of what party we're affiliated with, dealing with a lot of the same things as we all are similarly, regardless of what party we're affiliated with, committed to making sure our elections go smoothly and are accessible and secure. And so for that cross-partisan collaboration is really key. The secretaries of state who are running elections this year talk weekly at least, and many times in between as we share ideas and perspectives or feedback or just words of encouragement right now. And that's been, really one of the reasons why I think we're going to see successful elections this November, because we are all operating in 50 different elections, but we're all sharing stories, collaborating, and offering best practices and suggestions to each other as we deal with similar challenges state to state.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I'm sure that you both have heard very exaggerated doomsday predictions of what election day on November 3rd will look like, especially in swing states like Michigan. And I know that most of us on this call or on the Zoom are used to sitting in front of our TVs and waiting for election results to roll in. Trey, could you give us sort of an idea of what we can expect to find out on election night? How long do you think it will take for all the results?
Sure. Election night's going to look different this year. One of the things I will say that it's been a long trend, not just this year, but we've seen more and more states allow voters to vote in advance of Election Day, whether that's in person without an excuse or by mail without an excuse. So more of these votes are counted in advance. And one of the things that hasn't gotten a lot of attention really until this year is, what are the state or local rules on when can those absentee ballots, those paper ballots that are cast by mail or dropped off in a kiosk, when can they be processed? Because one thing, if you think about this, when you go in and vote in person, let's just say there's a poll worker there who will help determine your eligibility. You give an ID, they know you, you sign your name, you do something to show, okay, you're eligible, you take your ballot and you go vote. Well, imagine if all, dozens of precincts were all shoved into one spot and you had to determine all those eligibilities at one time. I mean, that's essentially the challenge of vote by mail. So in states that haven't amended their laws to allow processing, not the counting, not the revealing their results, but just is this an eligible ballot to be counted? If we haven't allowed our election officials the ability to start that work before Election Day, we're not going to get many of those results on election night. And we have to be careful in interpreting election results. How many votes have been cast? How many are outstanding? And from where are they coming? that we don't use the same framework as we did 4 years ago or 8 years ago, because it's going to be very, very different. We've seen in surveys that Republicans are approaching their methods of voting differently than Democrats. And some of this is because President Trump has weighed in, expressing displeasure. I'm being kind of polite about his word choice and his tone. He's not a fan of vote by mail. The result of that is we know that more Republicans are going to vote in person and on election day, and that more Democrats are likely, at least according to their indications, going to vote by mail. And so the timing of those results are going to kind of shade how, who's up, who's down. Also, we have a lot of states who are quickly changing their rules. Normally in the elections world, we like to see, the states that have gone vote by mail, like Oregon and Washington State, Colorado, gradually got there. They didn't go there overnight. And so, but this time we have a bunch of states going to vote by mail. We have the poll recruitment challenge, which means there's going to be different polling places than normal or fewer of them. And we have, a humongous expected turnout, the highest in the nation's history is what is likely to take place. So all these factors probably mean that 11 p.m. on Eastern time, which is the first time when networks will call an election, because that's when California's polls close, we're very unlikely to see an actual call of an election, even if one of their candidates happens to be up by a lot of votes at that particular time, because there'll be too many votes outstanding for us to determine that. And this is something that I've been talking a lot about, both to groups, to individuals, but also to the media, because they share responsibility in making sure that they cover this race correctly and they create the expectations for voters that not all the results are in. You can't say this number of precincts because there's so many votes being cast not at that precinct. They have to create the right expectations. We as voters and as citizens have to go into it with the right expectations and not lose faith in the system just because we don't know on election night who is the winner, and not lose faith in the system if one person starts in the lead early and then loses that lead later. Now, we're used to processing that. Because the precincts closest to the county, they come in first, and then the ones further out come in, and the analysts know all that, but this is a very different kind of environment. So that's my fear on election day, is that these expectations are not correct, and that campaigns take advantage of this and maybe push an advantage, say, I'm in the lead, stop counting the votes. All the votes have to count, and all the votes always count. That's one of the misnomers. We don't, the official president doesn't get sworn in until January. It doesn't happen until the electoral college. Elections are never certified on election night. Those are all unofficial. And this year we're going to have more votes not counted on election night. So I think that's just an important framework for folks to think through as they're watching, and don't fall for it if the campaign pushes out a message that I won, let's stop. No, we're not done, and we're never going to stop.
Thank you. Jocelyn, could you give us an idea of what to expect from local and state elections on November 3rd?
Well, yeah, and certainly just, really want to underscore everything Secretary Grayson just said. It's really important for us to not declare winners in any race until all the ballots are counted. That's how democracy works. And so my goal will be to make sure if anyone tries to get out in front of election results before we have counted every ballot, that we are clear as a election administrator, trusted source of information, exactly where we are in the process and exactly how many more ballots we estimate having to go. Now, at the same time, we are increasing the number of machines that we are allocating to open envelopes and tabulate ballots in the hours between when the polls close and when our results are ready for announcement. But at any point, those results will be unofficial, but importantly, know that behind the scenes, what's happening, at least in Michigan, is that currently under state law, all of these ballots, millions of ballots, will be sent to our clerks in the weeks ahead. They can't open those envelopes until election day morning, meaning at 7 a.m. on election day morning, they will just be beginning the process of opening, flattening out the ballots, and putting them into the tabulator. That is going to take a lot of time to get through, and it's going to take more than 12 hours to get through 3 million ballots. In our August primary, we had 1.6 million ballots sent through the mail, and it took until Wednesday night to get through them all. So we know we're at least talking Wednesday night, but when you have double that number for November, it will take maybe into Thursday and maybe even Friday. Now, it's not going to take weeks. It's not going to take months. but it will take time. And that's what we want people to know. This is the system working. This is our election administrators, our clerks counting the ballots in the way that they're permitted to under law to ensure secure and accurate results at the end of the day. And I would much rather wait 4 days to get the full results of an election than rush towards an inaccurate, incomplete result that we then have to spend several years wondering if what would have happened if we had been more careful about the process. So the name of our game is security and accuracy. That's what we're focused on, and we're ready to continually communicate to citizens in the time between when the polls close and our full count is released about exactly what's happening and why they should ultimately trust the results once we're done.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question before we open it up to Q&A. So I guess I'll pose it to both of you. There's a lot of distrust right now in our voting by mail system. Donald Trump has encouraged people to vote twice to test the system. And the recent news about the U.S. Postal Service, people are genuinely worried about their mail ballots making it on time. So what would you say to voters who are skeptical or worried about the security and reliability of mail-in voting?
Well, I think in Michigan, we have implemented time-tested secure techniques that have been cultivated for decades in some cases, like most importantly, the signature match. No ballot will be counted unless the signature on the envelope in which the ballot is in matches the signature for the voter's registration file. And one person, one vote. Once that signature is matched, that ballot is counted, no more votes, no more ballots. So even if someone were to try to send in fake ballots or multiple ballots, only one would count. And again, this is a time-tested, secure technique that has been cultivated and implemented for close to 2 decades in many states. Now that said, we also know at the same time, that citizens, while they can have complete knowledge about the ballot process and faith that their ballots will be counted, there are going to be consistent and perhaps escalating in volume efforts to confuse voters about their rights, confuse voters about the safety of their vote and the sanctity of their vote to further a political or partisan agenda, not to actually further the truth. And so what we know on our side is that the truth, the facts, the data about the security of the process and our work to make sure every vote counts, all of that is on our side. And so while it can be discouraging to have to consistently push back and correct misinformation, that is part of the work this year that we as election administrators must engage in vociferously and proactively to ensure voters are assured that whoever they vote for, their vote will count and the results of our elections will be an accurate reflection of their will.
Let me add a couple of things. I think Secretary Benson did a great job of giving the macro sense of you should trust your vote if you're going to cast it by mail. The system is going to work. But here's some things that you as an individual can do. If one is, make sure that's the appropriate way for you to vote. What are the options available to you in state law? Can you vote in person? Can you vote on election day? What is the best option for you? So let's say vote by mail is the option that you prefer because you're a student living away or because you're concerned about your health, or it's just convenient because then you don't have to go find the time to go vote when it's available in person. Request your ballot early. You have to give the process time to work. The Postal Service, even in its best days, would occasionally miss something here or there. So if you start early, if in the very small instances there's a potential problem with the delivery of a ballot to you, you have more time to fix that problem. So start early, request your ballot early. Check to see if your state has an online portal where you can check the status of that. Many states you can log on once you've requested that ballot and see where it is in the process. My request has been processed, the ballot has been mailed, the ballot has been received, the ballot has been, my eligibility has been determined in a positive way, and the ballot has been counted. So check to see if that's available. And if at any point along the way you get alarmed, hey, it's been too long since it was sent to me, or it was too long since I put it in the mail, reach out to your election official. There are also opportunities in most jurisdictions to drop off a ballot. You got to make sure that this is allowed, but you can drop off your ballots. You don't actually have to mail it back, and you can put it into a drop box. And again, usually those drop boxes will also be tied into to the online system. So there's a whole lot of things that you can do as a citizen to help make the system work better. And if for whatever reason you request a ballot, it doesn't show up, or you see a problem, call, or you can show up usually in a jurisdiction on election day and say, I've got this problem. My ballot didn't work. In Kentucky, in our primary, we had went to almost 75% of our votes were cast by mail, normally 5%. There were some ballots that were lost in the mail, or somebody thought they requested it or didn't do it right. So you can go in on election day. But the last thing I really want to say is, no matter how you return your ballot, pay close attention to the instructions on an absentee ballot. On election day, you have a poll worker helping you out. They'll put you to, they'll make sure you sign the right spot and offer the right eligibility. They'll hand you the correct ballot. They'll even help you with put the piece of paper into a reader, or if it's a screen, to help you do all that. When you're at home, you're on your own. And unfortunately, we see far too many ballots rejected because people forget to sign in the right place, or put they don't date it in the right place, and things like that. So make sure you pay attention to those. Many states allow you to cure that, because when they catch it, they're like, oh, there's a problem. Hey, Trey, you have until this particular day to come back and sign your signature in the right spot. But not all, and that's an extra burden. So be careful to make sure you process that ballot correctly, and do all the things that show that you're eligible to vote, so your ballot will count.
And just as a quick follow-up question, just speaking more generally, what sort of dangers do you think that this sort of hesitancy to vote by mail, or this distrust in the election process, poses to our democracy more generally? And how do we rectify that as a country? So and Jocelyn, go ahead.
Well, the work is there's going to be a certain moment after the, we will get through this election cycle. And there's going to be a certain moment after that point where we need to sit down as a country, as a populace, as secretaries of state, as thought leaders, and just kind of answer this question of where do we go from here. A lot of things are going to be decided. A lot of things are going to happen in the next 3 to 4 months. Of course, a lot of things happen, in the next 6 months. A lot of things have happened this year. But that said, I think, we do need to think through the damage that has been done, and also almost certainly will continue to be done to our elections process through the efforts to misinform the public, and through really the damage and the hits that our election system has taken by the near constant, political rhetoric that has been thrown at it in the past several months and years. So I do hope we can move forward after this election, regardless of what the results are, and just focus on keeping the strength of our democracy intact, because that's going to be critical. And the strength of our democracy being intact really depends on 2 things. One, voters being informed and engaged at every level. That means young voters. That means voters who will inherit our democracy in the future, and that means voters of all backgrounds really making a commitment, prioritizing becoming engaged citizens and informed citizens, and seeking trusted sources of information to be informed, and all the rest. And then the second thing it's going to require are election administrators at every level, state and local, committed to small d democracy, committed to making sure our systems work for everyone. And we already have a lot of that in place. And I've been really emboldened and encouraged by the fact that, whether it was when I was researching this office to write the book on the office in 2008, or now as Secretary of State 12 years later, that the vast majority of election administrators are truly dedicated to just making sure the process works on both sides of the aisle. But that said, we will have to kind of dig deep as a country, build those partnerships between election administrators and voters, and look forward towards the next election and the next election after that. Democracy will continue, but it's going to survive if we all dig deep and make sure it does.
And I think that I want to build on the last point the Secretary made about highlighting those, and they're not just random isolated moments. It's the norm where administrators are doing these for the right reason. They're servants, and they're thinking innovatively. They're ignoring party politics. One of the interesting things about elections is a lot of our states put the partisanship right up front and center, and since you have Republicans and Democrats working together side by side, and that's the law, because we know that having the transparency and having the party representatives there is one way to build trust in the system. And there's also people we ought to hold out. For example, today in the Washington Post, there was a great story of a local election supervisor in Florida who was trying to figure out use a stylus on their voting system, and we don't want the same person, we don't want 1,000 people using the same stylus on election day because of the pandemic. And so he and his staff figured out how to use a Q-tip and some aluminum foil to replicate a stylus that was cheap and disposable. That's a cool idea. Like let's highlight more of those things. In my state, the Republican Secretary of State and the Democratic governor set aside partisanship and under an existing emergency powers law, recrafted our election in the primary and in the general. Compromise met in the middle. Our primary was a successful effort. I'm confident the general is going to turn out really well. And they might fight about other things. In fact, they even fight on election policy issues. They have disagreements. But when it came time to setting all that aside and figuring it out, they did that. And there's all these other innovations. And so I think as we're having these, we focus on the bad. And unfortunately, I'm a Republican, so I feel this comfortable to say this. President Trump hasn't helped in this environment. Win or lose, we need to, he may be hurting himself with this criticism of mail-in voting. There may be some Republicans who should vote by mail who will be discouraged from voting by mail. The irony is the party and his campaign are pushing it, but he's criticizing it and undermining people's confidence. It's just not warranted in that process. And so we do have to move forward, but there are a lot of good opportunities. Secretary Benson, Secretary LaRose from Ohio doing lots of things together across party lines, across Big Ten rivalry lines to promote elections in their state. We could go on, and those are the things that I hope that more people learn about so that they can have their faith restored if they've lost it, or bolstered if they have it, that the system can work and does work in most instances.
Well, that was a very uplifting note. And with that, we will shift to some audience questions. I believe our first question is from Kevin Ballin.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here, Secretary Grayson and Benson. I know there's a lot of really exciting election reforms that are happening, automatic voter registration, online voter registration, same-day registration, all-mail elections. I'm just curious from sort of a chief election official standpoint, what's like the biggest bang for your buck in terms of sort of voter turnout and election security?
Well, those are two different goals, I think, but complementary ones. We certainly, I would say broadly speaking, partnerships across party lines, across state, local, federal, that bring in more resources are key to ensuring our elections are secure and accessible. From a policy standpoint, I think again, pure legislative policy, but access to the vote, the data suggests that basically removing voter registration as a barrier, enabling citizens to be automatically registered to vote or to register up to and on election day is one of the most dramatic ways that you can increase turnout. And indeed, we've seen that particularly among young people in Michigan, where the vast majority of citizens who in our past 6 elections where we've already had same-day voter registration, the vast majority of citizens taking advantage of that are college students and 18 and 19-year-olds in particular, by record numbers, significantly higher than any other age group. So that's notable. But I will say, we are on track to have record turnout this year, in part because we also are on track to have a record number of people voting by mail. People recognize the convenience of that, the popularity of that. There's no doubt that voters overwhelmingly voted it into our Constitution for a reason and now want to take advantage of that. So I think between those two, you certainly can modernize your elections process. And I do think there needs to be space to kind of think even more forward than that, and how we continually to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat, as many of us talk about, in order to, again, ensure we're continuing to make democracy accessible to our citizens, developing new ways to do that, while also protecting the security of the process.
So when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, the two election things where I spend most of my time, one is I would like to see a steady, albeit small, because I recognize if it's steady, it would probably have to be small, federal assistance to help election administrators so they can budget for that money, and that can help bolster election security. One of the things that's kind of been lost again because of the pandemic is there's a growing consensus among the left and the right that there is a role for the federal government in helping with election security, because it's really a national security function. And so you have libertarian groups like Freedom Works supporting this, as well as folks and groups on the left. They may disagree on other aspects of the federal role in elections, but that's one where we're starting to see, and I think a steady federal assistance that could be relied upon and budgeted that could allow capital purchases because you knew the money was coming. That would be one thing that I'd like to see once we kind of get through this election and out of the pandemic. The second one that I've been working on, and actually before Secretary Benson was elected and before the referenda, I actually testified in Michigan. It was one of the last, it was one of the states that did not have online voter registration, where you can update your voter registration. For example, if you have a state driver's license or identification. And I actually testified, Jocelyn, you may not even know this. This was when your predecessor was in office. Yeah, but I went up and testified before one of the Senate committees, I think, talking about OVR. And I do a lot of work on AVR, automatic or automated voter registration. I'm a Republican, I'm an election administrator, and sometimes Republicans and election administrators haven't loved what they think there's extra work or there's challenges with AVR. And I spend a lot of time explaining to them why a more accurate list is something Republicans, Democrats, election administrators, everybody ought to care about. It's a more accurate list. We can save money, and AVR is just a great way to do it. Citizens they don't understand why when they go update their license or their address with some government agency, why doesn't it get transferred to others? And so this is actually something that's not all that hard and shouldn't be all that controversial. And so again, the states that don't have some form of AVR, my hope is that we'll get back to focusing on those states over the next couple of years and get them into place and figuring out, what is the incremental reform in that state to get there. So those are the two that I spend my time on, when we're not in a pandemic, trying to help people make the necessary changes to vote in a pandemic.
Thank you, Kevin, for that question. The next question will come from Neha. If you could just introduce yourself and say what school you're from. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you both for speaking with us tonight. I feel like I've learned so much. My name is Neha Saju, and I'm from Rutgers University. I'm zooming in from New Jersey. I do work with the Center for Political Participation at the Eagleton Institute, and I want to ask that making voting more accessible will definitely be beneficial for democracy. But do you think that standardizing civil practices like registering to vote, voting by mail, going to the polls across all the 50 states would be a potentially advantageous solution?
Well, it's a really important question because notably a lot of people recognize that every state has a different political ecosystem and electoral history. What may work in one state may not easily be replicable to another, and certainly maybe not in the same time frame. I try to take the approach that yes, that this consistency, those sort of best principles in place, that are articulated in some of the important federal legislation like the NVRA or the Help America Vote Act or the Voting Rights Act, certainly also set some sort of expectations and standards federally, which are important. But that federal-state partnership, allowing states to have variations within those standards, is really important as well, because again, every state is in a different place. And then when you look at what is best for states, I always say we need to meet voters where they are and deliver them the type of democracy that they want, because that's what matters. I think it's ironic that so much about democracy often and democracy policy often is, let's us elected officials decide where you can vote, in what way you can vote, and what opportunities we're going to give you so that you can cast your ballot. When it really should be flipped. I mean, we work for the people. It should be the citizens telling us exactly, what they want, how they want to register, what they want in terms of options for voting. And I love that in Michigan, that's exactly what happened in 2018. We actually had citizens effectively enact amendments to the state constitution saying, this is what we want in our state. And there may be future iterations of that and evolutions in the years ahead. To me, that the preeminent rule makers in a democracy need to be the people. And to that extent, the way that we can perhaps replicate best practices and state to state, that can be very beneficial. And when you look at a state like Oregon or Washington, where you did have online voter registration and other types of election innovations originate there. It often was because people wanted them and got their local clerks to bring it forward or simply did it themselves. So, with that, again, consistency is good, but it has to, whatever changes or rules that make up a democracy do need to be driven by the people. And that, frankly, underscores really what your role and others can be. I mean, what civic engagement is not just voting. It is being invested in developing and actually implementing the system of democracy that you want. And without that, others will, perhaps elites, perhaps elected officials will fill that void and try to create the democracy that they want. but really the people reserve that authority until you give it up. And so, that's why, to me, moving forward out of this particular moment requires all of you as our best and brightest, as those who are prepared to inherit our democracy in the future and lead the way, to really think strategically and specifically about what your role is going to be, not whether you're going to have a role, but what your role is going to be in protecting and ensuring a healthy democracy for years to come.
I generally agree with Secretary Benson. I mean, I think the short answer is I don't like to see too many 50 state across uniformities. We have a couple hundred years of states running their own elections and some even variations at the local level. And it allows for some innovation. It allows you to customize what makes sense for those states. But there are times when there's a consensus at the national level that things need to be done. And that's what we've seen in federal legislation. So you heard Secretary Benson earlier reference the Help America Vote Act. That was a bill passed in 2002 in reaction to the 2000 presidential election. And as a country, we made the decision every state needed to have a statewide database. No state should be using punch cards. Our voting system should be an election should be more accessible. And for the first time ever, the federal government provided some money to make those changes. And that was consensus. It was a bipartisan bill. And I got elected in 2003. So my first term was essentially implementing the requirements of that act. And so prior to that, you couldn't share voter registration lists across state lines. State of Ohio, for example, let's pick on Ohio. I think that's Jocelyn and I can do that. They didn't have a statewide list. So you would register in Hamilton County. And then when you moved to one county over to Butler County, you run both lists. And if you're a campaign trying to figure out who lives where, if you're trying to, if you wanted just an accurate list, that's a terrible way to do it. So the federal government passed a law. 7 or 8 years later, we had a problem with, there was consensus that we needed to help military and overseas voters. It was a challenge getting ballots back and forth across the country. So the MOVE Act was passed, and it required that ballots be available and sent out, I think it's 45 days in advance of the election. So there would be enough time for it to get there and get back. And again, consensus around that. So the funding that I mentioned in response to the earlier question, that's another one where I think there's a fair amount of consensus. But what I don't want to see is one party or the other shoving something down the throats when there isn't consensus. So let's say there was Republicans controlled everything and they passed a photo ID bill that really, there's not consensus around that. Or on the reverse, the Democrats got in control and wanted to do something. So I think at the federal level, a consensus, when there's consensus, that's something we ought to pursue. Otherwise, it needs to be more at the state level. And that's probably politically the most effective way anyway, because that's at the end of the day, these legislators pass laws. And one of the things that I always tell new secretaries of states, and also folks who just want to change laws, you got to remember that the policymakers, the members of Congress and the legislators, they all got elected under the old system. So it works for them. And that's also the way they're viewing it. They know what their experience was. They know what it was like to run and win and how the votes were counted and how they were cast and all those things. And so when you're trying to convince them to make a change, you got to realize that one, the system worked for them, and two, they're just used to it. They think they are informed on this issue. So unlike maybe other issues where they may defer to experts, they think they're the experts when it comes to elections. So just something that's just a political reality that anybody trying to make any kind of change has to acknowledge that it creates a barrier to change. It's why it's hard. But once you know it, then you can figure out how do I craft an argument to convince them that they're wrong.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks for that question, Neha. Our next question is from Dennis. If you want to unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Most definitely. My name is Dennis Rashindi. I'm currently a senior McConnell Scholar at the University of Louisville. And former Secretary Grayson, this is more of a pointed question for you coming from Kentucky. How do you think that this upcoming decision and announcement from AG Daniel Cameron is going to affect the scope of Kentucky's elections this cycle?
Sure. For those first of all, I can't really do the L's up because I'm a UK guy, but I won't do an L's down. What Dennis is talking about is the Breonna Taylor decision. We anticipate, it didn't happen today, but maybe tomorrow, that Attorney General Cameron, who I believe he was a U of L grad. I don't know if he was a McConnell scholar or not.
He was.
And our Secretary of State was a McConnell scholar, Mike Adams. So he's going to make the decision, or his office is going to make the announcement, we think tomorrow, about who, if anybody, will be prosecuted under what charges. And it's actually, the state's kind of on pins and needles right now. The downtown is literally on lockdown, and I was hitting refresh on Twitter every couple minutes. One, it'll just be good to know what the prosecution decision is. But I would caution that if there is a decision to prosecute, that's only the beginning of a prosecution. Many times in this country, we've seen prosecutors bring charges that, from an outsider standpoint, seem like they were justified, but when a jury sees the evidence, they go a different way. But it will be good to have at least this issue out of, this uncertainty, this part of the uncertainty removed. But it's tough. I mean, are you on campus in Louisville, or at least in the city? You're not.
I am. We're actually downtown. We're kind of just locked in the house right now, just anticipating as to what's supposed to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I used to work with General Cameron. He was at our law firm before he ran, and he's got to do the right thing with the evidence points to. And this is a tough case. For those who are curious, the New York Times did a great story a couple weeks ago that really explained, from what they could gather, the evidence that happened on that particular night. And it's not an easy prosecutorial decision, which is why I think they haven't publicly announced it yet. So we'll see. I just hope that this is one where, when people say, you're in our thoughts and prayers, but keep Louisville and keep Kentucky in your thoughts and prayers for the next 24, 48 hours, because depending on how this, what is announced, it could be a tough time for us. So hang in there, Dennis.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Just as a quick follow-up question to that, regardless of what the Attorney General announces, do you think that the charges, if any, that he announces will have a significant impact on any elections at the state or local level in Kentucky?
I'm not convinced that, at the local level, it could have some impact. I mean, there are some, if you're probably asking first and foremost about the U.S. Senate race between Republican leader Mitch McConnell and Amy McGrath. I've always thought all along that race was, that McConnell was going to win. He would never be in doubt, but there would just be a lot of noise in that race. And I don't anticipate anything that outcome is, any decision that General Cameron makes will impact the outcome in that race. But there are a number in Greater Louisville. There are a number of state legislative races that are particularly close and contested. That could be something we could see. The congressional race there is not really being contested. The Democrat will win handily, Congressman Yarmouth. But it could impact some of the local races. The mayor of Louisville is not on the ballot. He's come under a lot of fire, and one thing that has definitely happened is ironically, right after he became the head of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, there's been criticism from the left and the right, Republicans, Democrats, pretty much all across the board, on his performance in office, and he actually got a vote of no confidence from the local government. So that's one where already we've seen a big political change where he swept a re-election in 2018, and I think could have run one more time, and probably would have been another easy re-election for him, and he's probably done. The bigger question is not will he win again, but will he survive the term? Will he resign early because of all the public demand? But I don't see it impacting the McConnell-McGrath race at all.
Thank you. The next question is from Amanda. If you want to unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Yes, hello. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. My question is about this year. We've seen so many different policy changes in how elections are being run because of COVID-19. And I'm wondering how you think this will impact the future of elections, if these changes will be permanent or not, and how our elections will look different after this year.
Want to go first on that one, Jocelyn?
Yeah, so certainly what we have learned to do this year is adjust and adapt and innovate. And I think a lot of the innovations that have developed in not just in our industry, but in other industries as well, will stand the test of time as we take this opportunity to put best practices in place to, in our industry, in election administration, ensure votes can be counted and cast securely. So certainly innovations like vote by mail, which has been amplified and given a new sense of urgency with so many citizens not feeling safe to leave their home. I think that is something that's going to stay in place. Certainly, I hope that election workers who have a good experience this year and sign up because of the pandemic, because they want to serve, may become, continual or maybe even lifelong poll workers or election workers in the future. So there are a number of things like that that I think are just best practices broadly that have become particularly critical during the pandemic. That will potentially transform our elections for the future, but that remains to be seen. Again, my principle is, let's see what the voters decide. Let's let the voters lead us to how they want their democracy to work. What we've certainly seen in Michigan is more citizens than ever before want to vote by mail, and we anticipate that will continue. More citizens than ever before have been voting, which we hope is a trend that will continue, and more citizens than ever before have been signing up to be election workers, which we hope is a trend to continue. And we'll try to invest in the post-election moment in helping those trends continue, as well as many other things that have developed this year, like the partnerships many of us have developed with our local sports teams that have helped create new opportunities for in-person voting at arenas, and also working with athletes and sports personnel to fill critical election worker needs. We hope those partnerships will also continue.
Yeah, ditto. I agree. I mean, I think the partnerships, if those will last, because these are recurring problems, whether you're voting in the pandemic or not. We always need poll workers. We always need to communicate to folks who are not, the folks like all of you who are paying attention to Harvard John F. Kennedy Jr. forums. And so the ability to use influencers and athletes. I mean, today I got an email from the Cincinnati Reds telling me that it was celebrating National Voter Registration Day. And I knew it was coming because we've seen the sports teams really step up, but it was just great. And so there are probably people who hadn't thought about it, who aren't in the loop. I also think this whole vote by mail, vote early in person, the more voters experience that, they're going to like voting. I used to call it voting the way you live, and having that flexibility to choose the best option. That's going to be, if I can use a cliche or metaphor, hard. That genie is going to be hard to put back in the bottle. Now, some states that where the legislature has control, maybe it'll, and these were emergency powers. Maybe you'll see some pushback from that, but voters are probably going to like the fact that they could vote the way they wanted, vote the way it was most convenient, vote the way it was safe. And when we're not in the pandemic, they're not going to accept going back to traditional election day. And policymakers, legislators are going to have to adapt. Our hope in the election administration space, though, is that these changes will come gradually with more advanced planning and more notice so that we can implement them effectively. I've been extraordinarily impressed with the speed and the adaptability of election administrators, but it would be sure nice to be able to make that pivot on a more scheduled and controlled basis.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that question, Amanda. Thank you, Secretary Benson and Secretary Grayson, for joining us tonight. I know I learned a lot. Hopefully everyone else did too. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And we hope you'll join us again this Thursday at 6 p.m. for our next forum at the Institute of Politics.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Good to be back virtually.
Yes, hope to be back in person soon.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.
See you.
Bye.